I was traveling alone, a necessity for my job that required late-night drives across the state. On one such trip, I found myself pulling into a small motel that sat at the edge of a sleepy town, its neon sign flickering sporadically against the night sky. It had been a long day, and I was grateful for a place to rest my head, even if the motel looked slightly worn down. The clerk behind the counter had an unsettling air about him. He was thin with sunken cheeks, his eyes darting nervously as he handed me the key to room 7. He mumbled something about the Wi-Fi and the amenities, but my mind was elsewhere. All I could think about was crawling into bed and getting a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. As I made my way to my room, I noticed the peeling paint on the walls and the strange odor that lingered in the air. The entire place felt neglected, as if it had been forgotten by time. I pushed the door open, and it creaked ominously. The room was dimly lit and sparsely furnished: a small bed, a rickety desk, and a television that looked like it belonged in the 80s South. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, allowing myself a moment to breathe. The hum of the air conditioning was a welcome sound as I checked my phone for messages. There was nothing urgent, just a few notifications from social media. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, the day's exhaustion pulling me under almost immediately. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a loud banging noise. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I sat up, straining to hear over the silence of the room. The banging came again, more persistent this time. It sounded like it was coming from the adjacent room, a rhythmic pounding that sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just someone moving furniture or perhaps a drunken guest. I rolled over and pulled the covers up to my chin, attempting to ignore the noise, but sleep eluded me. The banging continued, echoing through the thin walls like a haunting drumbeat. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and approached the door. Pressing my ear against it, I could hear muffled voices, indistinct and urgent. I thought about calling the front desk, but I hesitated. It felt silly to involve someone for what could be nothing more than an annoyance. Instead, I decided to knock gently on the door, hoping to quiet whatever commotion was happening. I rapped lightly, and the noise stopped immediately. I waited, holding my breath, hoping for a response. Moments later, I heard footsteps approach. The door swung open slowly, revealing a disheveled man with wild hair and bloodshot eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I heard some noise, I stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. "Is everything okay?" He stared at me for a moment, and I could see panic flickering behind his eyes. "Everything's fine," he said too quickly. "Just a little rough night." Before I could respond, he closed the door with a swift movement, leaving me standing there in confusion. I returned to my room, the unease creeping back into my mind. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come. I kept hearing soft sounds, shuffling, whispers. It was like a scene from a horror movie, and I felt like the only sane person trapped in a nightmare. As the minutes turned into hours, I finally heard the door to the adjacent room creak open. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. The man emerged, looking around nervously as if he were being hunted. He glanced towards my door, and our eyes met for a brief second. He looked terrified, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He took off down the hall, moving quickly, almost like he was fleeing from something. I wanted to call out to him, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk, my hands shaking. The clerk answered, his voice flat and uninterested. "Yeah, I think something is wrong in room 8, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a man who seems really distressed. People come and go all the time," he replied dismissively. "You don't need to worry about it. Can you at least check on it?" I pressed. "I just feel uneasy." The clerk sighed. "Fine, I'll send someone." I hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and fear. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the atmosphere around me thickened. The shadows seemed to grow, and I felt a tingling at the back of my neck, as if I was being watched. A few minutes later, there was a loud banging on the door. I jumped, my heart racing again. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. To my surprise, I saw the clerk standing there with a look of concern etched on his face. I opened the door, and he stepped inside, glancing around nervously. "Where's the guy from the next room?" he asked, looking agitated. "I need to talk to him." I shook my head. He left. He seemed really scared. I thought something was wrong. The clerk cursed under his breath and moved to the door, opening it wide and peering down the hallway. He can't get far. I need to find him before he causes any more trouble. Before I could ask what kind of trouble he was referring to, he stormed out of the room, leaving me alone again. I glanced back at my phone, contemplating calling the police. But as I stared at the screen, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was the man from Roommate, standing still and facing away from me. My heart pounded as I tried to call out to him, but my voice failed me again. Suddenly, he turned around, and my blood ran cold. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just fear, it was pure terror. He glanced over his shoulder as if he were expecting something to come for him. I stepped back, pressing my back against the wall, my pulse racing. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash came from the direction of the clerk's office. It reverberated through the hall, and the man's expression shifted to one of panic. He turned and bolted down the hallway, moving faster than I thought possible. I wanted to follow, to help him, but I felt frozen in place. I heard shouting from the clerk's office, voices raised in anger. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic, desperate. The entire motel felt like it was coming alive, vibrating with tension. I glanced back towards my room, my instincts telling me to pack up and leave, but curiosity kept me rooted. That's when I saw a dark shape moving in the shadows behind the man. It was low to the ground, creeping along like a predator stalking its prey. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure drew closer. I could make out its features now, a grotesque, twisted face with sharp teeth bared in a vicious snarl. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen, its body contorted and malformed, gliding silently on elongated limbs. It was following the man, and the fear on his face transformed into sheer horror as he realized he was being hunted. He screamed, and it was a sound that echoed through the hall, a piercing wail of utter terror. I stumbled backward, my instincts finally kicking in. I turned and ran toward my room, fumbling for the lock as the sounds of chaos erupted behind me. The creature's growls mixed with the clerk's shouts as I desperately tried to get the door closed. I slammed it shut and locked it, pressing my back against the door. My heart raced as I listened to the chaos outside. The sounds of shouting continued, but they were mixed with the horrifying noises of the creature growling, scratching, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged. I grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking as I dialed 911, but just as I pressed call, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I frantically searched for the flashlight in my bag, but the phone screen was the only light illuminating the room. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on my door, making me jump. I froze, fear coursing through my veins as the door rattled. I knew it was the creature outside, trying to break in. I backed away, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The banging continued, relentless, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor. Then, just as quickly as it started, the banging stopped. An eerie silence fell over the room. I hesitated, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. I slowly approached the door, peering through the peephole again. But there was nothing, no sign of the man, no creature. Just darkness. I turned back to the room, my breath hitching in my throat. I grabbed my bag, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. I moved toward the window, planning to climb out if necessary, but before I could even reach it, the door creaked open. My heart dropped as I turned to face whoever had entered. But standing there wasn't the clerk or the creature. It was the man from Roommate, his face ashen, his eyes wide with fear. He stepped inside, his gaze locking onto mine. "They never stop following," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'll come for you next." I didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my things and ran out into the night, not stopping until I was far from the motel, far from the horrors that lurked within its walls. Even now, whenever I check into a motel, I can't help but look over my shoulder, waiting for the whispers to start. The neon sign flickered above the motel entrance, its harsh glow illuminating the cracked pavement and the remnants of a long-forgotten landscape. It was late, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant hum of a passing car. I was exhausted from driving for hours and grateful to finally reach my destination. I had been on the road for far too long, and this seemed like the perfect place to rest for the night. The small motel was nestled just off the highway, and although it looked a little shabby, it was better than sleeping in my car. The check-in desk was manned by an older woman with a weathered face, her eyes darting around nervously. I brushed it off as fatigue and signed in, Receiving my key without a word, room 12 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The carpet was worn, and the paint on the walls was peeling, but it had a certain charm. I pushed open the door, stepping inside to the musty scent of old linens and stale air. The room was small, but it was clean enough. A single bed occupied the center, and a window looked out into the dark parking lot. I tossed my bag onto the bed and decided to freshen up. The bathroom was equally aged, the shower curtain a faded floral pattern that had seen better days. As I washed my face, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the cracked mirror. My eyes looked tired, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd made a mistake by stopping here. After a quick shower, I settled on the bed and turned on the small television. Static filled the screen before a grainy image flickered to life. The motel had no cable, but it offered a few local channels. I flipped through them absently, trying to shake off the unease settling in my stomach. I was too tired to focus on anything specific. A soft knock at the door jolted me upright. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. Who could it be at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. I opened the door cautiously but found no one there. Just the empty corridor, dimly lit and silent. I closed the door and locked it, brushing off the incident as nothing. Maybe it was just a figment of my tired mind. I crawled back into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. The muffled sounds of the television played in the background, lulling me towards sleep. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the building, shaking me from my drowsiness. I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding. The sound had come from somewhere down the hall, followed by a series of rapid footsteps. I strained to listen, but the noises faded as quickly as they had appeared. I told myself it was just other guests, perhaps someone moving around. Still, an unsettling feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. I turned off the TV and lay back down, hoping to shake off the anxiety. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, when I heard a soft whisper outside my window. It was faint, but the words were clear. "Help me." My heart raced, and I held my breath, unsure if I had imagined it. I forced myself to look out the window, but the parking lot was empty. Only the dim light from the neon sign cast eerie shadows on the pavement. The whisper came again, a soft plea cutting through the silence. This time, it was louder, and I could have sworn it sounded like a child's voice. My pulse quickened, and I felt a rush of fear. What was happening? I felt compelled to open the window, to see if someone was outside. But what if I was wrong? What if it was all in my head? I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Against my better judgment, I pulled the curtain aside and leaned out. The air was cool, but the parking lot was still deserted. I could see the outline of the motel sign against the dark sky. Just as I was about to close the window, I caught a glimpse of movement near the far end of the lot, a shadow darting behind a parked car. I squinted, trying to make out what I had seen, but my heart sank as the figure vanished into the darkness. Panic rose within me, and I backed away from the window, my instincts screaming at me to get out of the motel. I grabbed my bag and decided I would leave immediately. As I turned to leave, I heard the soft knock at the door again, this time more insistent. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole once more. Nothing. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door, peering into the hallway. Nothing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the power went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. I froze, the silence enveloping me like a thick blanket. My heart pounded in my ears as I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light I had. Just as I switched it on, I heard the whispers again, more urgent this time. "Help me." I turned toward the sound, my breath quickening. It seemed to be coming from the stairwell at the end of the hallway. My instinct screamed for me to run, but something compelled me to move closer. I gripped my phone tightly and stepped forward, the light from the screen flickering as I made my way toward the sound. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as I approached the stairwell. I shined the light down the darkened steps, and to my shock, I saw a small figure standing at the bottom. A child. My heart twisted with concern. The figure was hunched over, shrouded in shadows, and I could barely make out a face. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained still, just barely visible in the darkness. I felt a mix of fear and compassion tug at my heartstrings. I was torn between wanting to help and the overwhelming urge to run. Just as I was about to turn back, the figure suddenly stood upright, revealing a gaunt face twisted into a grotesque smile. It wasn't a child at all. Its eyes were sunken, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the darkness spilling out like a void. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. It stepped forward, a sickeningly fluid motion, and I turned to run. But as I did, I felt a cold grip wrap around my ankle. I glanced back to see a skeletal hand reaching up from the shadows, pulling me down. Panic surged through me as I kicked and struggled against the grip, fighting to break free. I sprinted back toward my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, breathing heavily as I pressed my back against the door, my heart racing. I could hear the whispers again, but this time they were filled with laughter, a high-pitched sound echoing through the hallway. As I fumbled for my phone, I heard the sound of clothes scraping against the door. The grip around my heart tightened, and I scrambled to find the phone. Just as I turned the light on again, the door rattled violently, and I backed away, my mind racing for an escape. Then came a knock, a hard, deliberate knock that made the walls shake. I was frozen, unable to move, the laughter echoing around me. I knew I had to get out, but the fear rooted me in place. The knocking stopped, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Then came the whispers again, this time right outside the door. "It's here. Open the door." I felt a chill wash over me. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like the darkness was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I glanced at the window, the only option left. I bolted toward it and yanked it open, taking a deep breath as I prepared to climb out. Just as I was about to step outside, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moved across the wall, and my blood ran cold. Turning back, I saw the figure standing in the doorway, its form illuminated by the faint light of my phone. Its smile twisted further, revealing jagged teeth that glimmered in the dim light. I felt my breath catch as it raised a hand toward me, beckoning. Without thinking, I launched myself out of the window, landing hard on the ground outside. Pain shot through my ankle, but I pushed through it and sprinted toward my car. I could hear the laughter behind me, echoing in the night. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I scrambled to unlock the door. I could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers growing louder, drowning out everything else. As I finally got the door open, I jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I took a moment to catch my breath, staring wide-eyed into the rearview mirror. The motel loomed behind me, but it was empty now. No figures, no shadows, just the flickering neon sign. I threw the car into gear and sped away, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, its smile still stretched wide, its eyes glinting in the dark. And just as quickly as I saw it, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but the chilling realization that I was not alone on that long, dark road. The dim glow of the neon sign flickered outside my window, casting an eerie blue light across the cramped motel room. I had been driving for hours, exhausted and in desperate need of rest. The sign promised a warm bed, cheap rates, and, most importantly, solitude. After a long week of work, the last thing I wanted was company. So I paid for the room, received my key from the surly clerk, and headed up to the second floor. The hallway was narrow and dank, the musty smell of old carpet and stale air wrapping around me like a shroud as I made my way to my room. As I passed by the other doors, I couldn't help but notice the peeling paint and the faded numbers. Each door looked like it had its own story to tell, but I wasn't interested in hearing any of them. I just wanted to collapse in bed and forget the world outside. When I entered my room, I was met with the scent of mildew mingling with cheap air freshener. The decor was outdated, with floral pattern wallpaper that had seen better days and a small television perched on a rickety dresser. I tossed my bags on the bed, pulled the curtains tight to block out the flickering neon light, and sank into the mattress. Sleep came quickly, and for a while, I was lost to the world. It was a little after midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud banging. My heart raced as I sat up, my eyes darting around the dim room. The sound echoed again, more insistent this time, coming from the adjacent room. I strained to listen, wondering if I should call the front desk or mind my own business. The banging continued, a rhythmic thump that made my skin crawl. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Most guests were probably asleep. Why was someone banging on the wall like that? It sounded like a desperate plea, but who was on the other side? Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Curiosity had a way of getting the better of me. I slipped on my shoes and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was louder now, and it seemed to be coming from the room next to mine. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to knock or just go back to bed. But just as I was about to turn away, the banging stopped, replaced by a soft, muffled voice. Help meth words sent a chill down my spine. Was someone in trouble? I hesitated, then knocked lightly on the door. I heard movement from inside, and my heart raced. What if I was opening a can of worms? Who is it? A woman's voice called out, shaky and laced with fear. It's just me, the guy next door. I heard some noise. Are you okay? There was silence on the other side, and I wondered if I had made a mistake. Then the voice returned, sounding even more frantic. Please, just go away. I didn't like the sound of that. Something was definitely off. My instinct screamed at me to walk away, but I felt an undeniable urge to help. I pressed on. Are you sure you're okay? Should I call someone? There was a pause, and then the voice came back, low and raspy. They can't help me. You need to leave. Now. The urgency in her voice sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I stepped back from the door, glancing around the hallway. I felt exposed and vulnerable standing there, but I couldn't just abandon her. I'm going to get help, I shouted back. Stay right there. I turned on my heel and hurried down the hall toward the stairs. The motel felt more like a maze in the dark, the flickering lights casting shadows that danced ominously against the walls. I reached the front desk and found the clerk staring blankly at the TV, oblivious to my presence. I cleared my throat, catching his attention. There's a woman in the room next door. I think she needs help. He glanced up, his face expressionless. What room? I pointed to the number on the wall. She said someone was trying to get in. She sounded scared. The clerk frowned, unimpressed. Look, it's late. People get drunk, they fight. It's none of my business. I felt a surge of frustration. I'm telling you, something is wrong. I think she's in danger. The clerk shrugged and returned his attention to the television. I knew I wouldn't get anywhere with him, so I headed back to my room, my mind racing with anxiety. I felt guilty for not doing more to help her. When I reached my room, I paused, listening for any sounds from next door. The hallway was silent. I knocked on the wall, hoping to get a response, but there was nothing. My heart sank as I paced the small space, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, I heard a soft shuffle outside my door. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to see a shadow moving under the crack at the bottom. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. The soft sound of footsteps grew closer, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I had to know what was going on. I slowly opened the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I took a deep breath and stepped out, moving cautiously toward the woman's door. Before I reached it, I heard the sound again, louder this time, echoing down the hallway. The sound of someone dragging something heavy across the floor. It was coming from the room on the other side, and my stomach twisted in knots. I had to see what was happening. I knocked on the woman's door again, but there was still no response. Then, I noticed something strange, a light flickering under the door. It was the same rhythmic flicker as the neon sign outside. With my heart racing, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. I stepped inside, my senses on high alert. The room was empty, save for the bed, a small dresser, and the flickering light emanating from the bathroom. I hesitated, then moved toward the source. As I approached, I heard muffled sounds, whispers, soft but urgent. I pushed open the bathroom door and gasped at the sight before me. The woman was there, but something was terribly wrong. She was kneeling on the floor, her back to me, and around her were dozens of flickering candles, casting an eerie glow. She was mumbling something under her breath, and my instinct screamed for me to get out. Just as I turned to leave, she whipped around, her eyes wide and wild. They were not the eyes of a frightened woman. They were dark, hollow, and filled with a sinister energy that froze me in place. You shouldn't have come here, she hissed, her voice shifting into something deep and unnatural. My mind raced, trying to process the situation. Who was this woman? What was happening? As I stumbled back, I felt a sharp pull at my gut, as if something was dragging me toward her. I shook my head and turned to flee, but the moment I stepped back into the hallway, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. A figure loomed at the end of the corridor. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its face hidden from view, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch infinitely. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, gliding closer, its presence suffocating. I ran for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, but just as I reached the first step, the woman's voice echoed behind me. "Help me," I hesitated, glancing back. The figure stood between me and the room, its presence a wall of darkness. I had to make a choice. Without thinking, I bolted down the stairs, my mind racing with fear. I burst through the front door and into the cool night air, gasping for breath as I stumbled away from the motel. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I jumped in and started the engine, throwing the car into reverse. As I sped away, I glanced back at the motel. The flickering sign cast a ghostly glow over the building, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman standing at the window, staring at me with her hollow eyes. My heart raced, and I pushed the pedal to the floor, determined to leave that nightmare behind. Days later, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something horrible. I tried to forget about the motel, but the memories haunted me. I found myself scouring online forums for any mention of the place, hoping to find answers. That's when I stumbled upon an old article about the motel's dark past. Years ago, a group of people had vanished from their rooms, leaving behind nothing but flickering candles and strange symbols drawn in the dust. They were never found. I felt my stomach drop as I read the words. It was all connected. The woman I had encountered was a remnant of those who had disappeared. The motel was a trap, a dark place where those who entered were never meant to leave. I shuddered at the thought, knowing that my escape was nothing more than a stroke of luck. But that wasn't the worst part. As I scrolled through the comments on the article, one stood out to me. "I was there the night they vanished," it said. "I saw the figure in the hallway. I heard the whispers. But when I left, I thought I had escaped." My blood ran cold as I read the final line. "I still hear them at night, and they're coming back." I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue. It was late at night when I finally spotted the flickering neon sign of a motel, its light barely cutting through the dense fog that had rolled in. The name was faded, barely legible, but the promise of a warm bed and a hot shower was enough to draw me in. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of stones beneath my tires breaking the stillness of the night. The motel appeared old but had a certain charm, with its rustic wooden beams and bright red doors. As I parked, I noticed the lack of other vehicles. Just my luck to arrive at a nearly deserted motel in the middle of nowhere. A flicker of unease washed over me, but I shrugged it off as exhaustion. I stepped inside the office, and the bell above the door jingled softly. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty. The clerk, an elderly man with a long beard and twinkling eyes, looked up from his newspaper and smiled. "Welcome," he said in a gravelly voice. "You must be tired." I nodded, grateful for the warm welcome. I paid for a room and he handed me a key with a brass tag, room 7. It was the only key on the ring. I wondered briefly if the motel had seen better days but quickly dismissed the thought. I was too tired to care. As I made my way to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but the parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I reached my door and unlocked it, the key turning smoothly in the lock. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a small desk, and a tiny bathroom. I dropped my bags and headed straight for the shower, hoping to wash off the weariness of the road. After my shower, I threw on a pair of sweats and sat on the edge of the bed, contemplating whether to go to sleep or watch some television. Just as I reached for the remote, there was a knock on the door. It was unexpected. I froze for a moment, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight. Who could it be? I cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. I hesitated, considering just ignoring it and going back to the bed, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door a crack, peering into the empty hallway. Nothing but silence greeted me. I stepped back inside and closed the door, shaking off the eerie feeling. I tried to focus on the television, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in my stomach. The room felt too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, echoing in the silence. After a few minutes of restless flipping through channels, I decided it was time for bed. I turned off the television, plunging the room into darkness, and crawled under the covers. Sleep came slowly, my mind still racing with thoughts of the road and the strange knock at the door. I tossed and turned, finally drifting off into a restless slumber. It felt like mere moments had passed when I was jolted awake by another knock, louder this time. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The knock came again, insistent and firm. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. Just silence. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was almost 2 a.m. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cool floor. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, more frantic this time. I peered through the peephole once more, but again there was nothing. I took a deep breath and opened the door a few inches, ready to confront whoever was on the other side, but there was no one there. I stepped out into the hallway, the dim light flickering overhead casting strange shadows along the walls. I glanced to my left and then to my right, but there was no sign of life. The hairs on my arms prickled as I felt a sudden chill in the air. It was to quiet. Suddenly, I heard a soft giggle echoing from down the hall. It was childlike, innocent, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to follow the sound, my instinct screaming at me to retreat back to my room. But curiosity pulled me forward. I walked down the corridor, each step echoing ominously. As I approached the source of the giggle, the lights flickered overhead, and the air grew heavier. I reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. I hesitated at the door, my heart racing as I pushed it open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. I could barely make out the outline of a small figure in the corner, but when I stepped inside and turned on the light, there was nothing there. Just an empty room filled with dust and cobwebs. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of dread that washed over me. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and isolation. I turned to leave when I heard the giggle again, clearer and closer this time. I spun around, my pulse quickening. That's when I saw a small, shadowy figure darting across the room, just out of sight. My breath hitched in my throat as I backed away, ready to run back to my room. But before I could make it to the door, the lights flickered once more, and I felt a sudden chill sweep through the air. The giggle turned into a high-pitched shriek, echoing through the room as the figure lunged at me. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, my heart racing as I scrambled to get away. I threw the door open, racing back down the hallway, the laughter following me, growing louder and more chaotic. I reached my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against the door, panting heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. The laughter had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I quickly grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but before I could dial, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart sank. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was a tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I could feel my body going cold as I crept toward the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I forced myself to look through the peephole again. A small child stood outside, her hair disheveled and her clothes tattered. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was something off about her smile. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the door. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to open the door. What if it was a trick? But the desperation in her voice tugged at something deep inside me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, begging me to let her in. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Just as I was about to open it, the lights flickered again, and I heard a loud crash from the end of the hall. It shook the ground beneath me, and I stumbled backward. The child's expression changed, twisting into something menacing as she pressed her hands against the door, her fingers curling around the edges. The door rattled violently, and I stumbled back in fear. I was trapped, caught between the child outside and whatever was making the noise down the hall. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to guide my way. Suddenly, I heard the door burst open, slamming against the wall. I turned, ready to face whatever was coming, but the room was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the child was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I ran to the window and threw it open, desperate for fresh air and an escape. The ground below was a sheer drop, but I had no choice. I climbed out, gripping the ledge, my heart pounding in my chest as I dropped down onto the gravel. I stumbled away from the motel, my heart racing, but as I turned back to look, I saw the motel lit up, the neon sign flickering ominously. Then I noticed it, the child standing in the window of my room, her eyes wide and unblinking. She smiled, a sinister grin that sent chills down my spine. I turned and ran into the darkness, vowing never to return. As I raced down the road, The laughter echoed in my ears, mingling with the sound of a child's voice whispering, "You can't escape." Years later, I still don't know what happened that night. I've never returned to that motel or the surrounding area, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear that laughter, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone.